Hi everyone, this is a short video that I'm going to call an introduction to social welfare policy. Let me tell you what we're going to do here in this talk. We're going to cover a few basics about policies and talk about the idea of needs and social problems, and then we'll conclude with a short lecture on sort of why social workers study policy and generally where we're going um, this semester. So this course is really about social policy, which we'll get to in a second. But let's just talk about this idea of policy before we get to um, social policy. So what I've put up here on the screen are just a couple of different sort of definitions of policy. Um, Policy might be a deliberate statement or set of statements about principles or a course of action determined or intended, excuse me, to achieve some kind of predefined outcome. So in that sense, you can sort of think about policy as where are you going and how are you going to get there? And that, I think, is this definition is sort of relevant for maybe an organization or a business or something like that. We often think about policy in the context of the federal government or maybe the state government, even the local government. But as we'll cover here in a second, most sort of organizations have policy, and that sort of dictates what it is we do in given situations. So, second definition of policy, for example, a set of plans or ideas about what to do in a specific situation to achieve a certain goal. And then the third I found that I sort of liked was a sort of high-level plan detailing or describing goals and procedures for a government or organization. Um, these definitions obviously have a lot of overlap, but basically what it is like I said a second ago, where are we going? Right? What's our goal, and how are we going to get there? And the how are we going to get there piece is sort of um, referenced in each of these definitions. In the first one, for example, it's sort of contained in the course of action words. In the second definition, it's sort of contained in the set of plan words. And then obviously the third definition uses the word plan as well. But policy in general, like I said, it's a statement of where we're going and sort of how we're going to get there. And so moving on to sort of the different kinds of entities that have policies here. And like I said a second ago, we certainly think about governments um, as sort of an entity that has policy, and certainly the government at all different levels um, sets policy that very much influences our lives. One of the policies I think about from time to time, um, because I live in a snowy part of the country, um, from say November to April, you can't park on the street uh, at night, and the reason for that is that if it snows, they have to be able to plow it and have to be able to plow, the sides of the street so that people can get sort of off the street very safely. So um, seemingly even innocuous policies about where you can park and when you can park in certain places and things like that are things that very much influence our behavior. If, for example, you didn't adhere to a parking policy, for example, you might get a ticket, and it might be $30 or $40, and that's money that I'm sort of not interested in parting with. So there's sort of consequences for not adhering to policy. Certainly, the kinds of policies that we're going to be dealing with in class here are not parking policy. They're sort of the big federal policies that influence how that influence the quality of people's lives. But the function of policy really is the same. And like I said a second ago, it's to lay out um, a, a, a direction of where we're going and a sort of set of steps for how it is we're going to get there. And then, of course, businesses have policies all the time. Institutions have policies. Institutions like libraries or churches or colleges and universities or sort of have policies. And then in in some respects, individuals have policies as well. And so um, let me give you a couple of examples here real quick. So for example, I have a policy sort of against eating spicy foods. That should say spicy, not specify. So I have a policy against eating spicy foods after 7:30. Otherwise, it sort of keeps me up all night. Right? This governs my behavior. So I try not to do a certain thing after 7:30 in the evening. An example of sort of a policy that a business instituted, U-Haul, the moving truck company, has just passed a policy preventing the hiring of people who smoke cigarettes or vape. That's presumably to control healthcare costs. There's probably some other reasons as well. And that's not in every state. It's in, as far as I know, it's in 21 states that permit that kind of limitation in a hiring process. But that particular policy might not affect everyone, but it certainly governs the behavior of the people who do the hiring. It's going to govern the behavior of people who might want to get a job at U-Haul. Just some examples. So a few common features of policy, and let me just, where am I? Let me just move myself so you can see the words here. So a few common features. Policies are usually set by a committee, so a group of people, after some kind of deliberation or consultative process. So a couple of examples. A board of directors might set a policy, and my assumption, I don't know, but my assumption is that when U-Haul recently passed, like I said, passed a policy preventing the hiring of smokers or vapors, my assumption is that there was a group of people, probably with representation from the board of directors and the senior leadership and maybe the union, if there is a union, that sort of got together to sort of hammer out the details of that policy. By the same token, a group of church elders might set some kind of a policy. And by elders I mean people who are leaders, either lay or spiritual, that kind of thing. And then, of course, government bodies set policies after deliberating amongst themselves or consulting with voters. When government bodies consult with voters, that's called a referendum. And every now and then you hear about referendums in the news, or you see something in the voting booth. That's essentially the government asking for our opinion on whether or not a certain policy should be instituted. So first common feature of a policy is that policies are generally set by a committee after some kind of consultative process. Second common feature is that policies direct behavior, and the other way to think of this would be that policies might direct very specific behavior, or they might prohibit a behavior. So I keep bringing up U-Haul here. U-Haul, for example, that prohibits a certain behavior. It prohibits the hiring of people who use tobacco products or vapor products. Let me give you. I came up with some other examples here. So if we go back to that church elder example, church elders might set a policy, and that policy says that donations for the next certain length of time are going to be used for the construction of a new building. A second kind of example about how a policy might direct behavior is in that second bullet point there. So think, for example, maybe police are not permitted to question people solely based on their race or ethnicity. This is actually something that's been in the news a lot as well. Recently. So policies, like I said, they direct behavior. So go back to the definition that I said here a second ago, definitions that we were talking about a second ago. This is the part of the policy definition that says, how are we going to get there? What are the behaviors that we're going to get there? And then that third common feature is that policies usually have some kind of goal in mind. So if we keep going with this sort of church elder example, The goal could be that this new building is going to help a church accommodate an expanding congregation and fulfill its mission. So this is the part of the policy definition that sort of says what's our goal, where are we going, and the part that I was talking about a second ago with respect to directing behaviors is how are we going to get there. So most policies can sort of be thought about in, I guess I'll leave myself up at the top there. Most policies that we talk about can be thought of in this way, and part of what we're going to do this semester with our assignments is think about a certain policy and what's the goal of that policy, and how does the policy sort of outline steps that we'll take to achieve that goal. Now, there's two kinds of policy goals, and this is one of the, well, yeah, I guess one of the first sort of important set of vocabulary terms for this semester. This is two kinds of policy goals. There's manifest goals and there are latent goals. Manifest goals are sort of explicitly stated things that can be measured and measured concretely. A latent goal might be implicitly stated, but it's also about advancing an idea or an ethos, right? Advancing maybe an ideology or something like that, or maybe preventing the advancement of an ideology. So it's something that's actually really hard to measure in sort of concrete and explicit terms. So here's an illustration of different manifest or a series of manifest and latent policy goals. So if we were talking about gun control policy, a manifest goal might be prevent injury or death. A latent goal, on the other hand, say a latent goal related to opposing gun control legislation might be protecting a Second Amendment rights. That's about protecting an idea or an ethos and an ideology. Most policy goals have a manifest component and a latent component to them. And it's actually our job as people who think about analyzing policy to sort of identify what are those manifest and latent goals. So this is an idea we'll sort of return to throughout the course of this semester. So up until this point, we've really been talking about policy in general. Social workers are usually interested in social policy. And so a definition of social policy is simply laws, rules, regulations that govern benefits and services provided by government and organizations funded by the government that help people meet their needs. There are dozens of examples of social policies that help people meet their needs. One that comes to mind is WIC, Women, Infants, and Children. That gives a monetary benefit to pregnant and nursing women, and to help them meet a need, which is presumably to maintain some kind of health status among themselves and their children. So this idea of need is kind of an important concept, and I have an illustration here on the next slide. Need is generally the difference between what a person has and what society defines as acceptable. So I think this picture on the next slide sort of is a good illustration. So suppose that this is what a person has. However, this is what society considers acceptable. And you could maybe think about this in terms of money, or access to healthcare, access to different kinds of things. Policy is intended to make up the difference. So policy would be intended at this sort of abstract level here to expand what a person has so that there is no difference between what they have and what society considers acceptable. So this idea of, I guess there's really no good place. I guess I'll put myself up here. Social policy is usually about advancing social justice. So the general goal, that sort of latent goal of social policy, is usually about advancing social justice. It's about making up the difference, or bringing someone or a group of people up to a certain standard of living. Um, Social justice is this word that social workers use quite frequently. It's part of it's part of the values of our profession. Um, it's part of sort of our vision about how a well functioning world should be. But social justice really is the equitable distribution of society's resources. It's about ensuring that people have equitable access to the social, the political, and the economic spheres. And so an illustration of that might be that social justice is about making sure that anyone who wants to can start a business, or anyone who wants to can access college. So in a socially just world, everyone who wanted to could start a business, or anyone who wanted to could start or could excuse me could access college. And social policy would be about ensuring that people had the opportunity to start a business or attend college if that's what it is they wanted to do. So a couple of examples of social policy. There are literally hundreds of examples of social policy. These are examples of federal social policy. The Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, Affordable Care Act, is also known as Obamacare. That dealt with healthcare, and obviously a number of things related to healthcare and the expansion of Medicaid. No Child Left Behind and its successor policy, the Every Student Succeeds Act, are examples of educational policy. The Servicemen's Readjustment Act is also known as the GI Bill, and that provided a number of benefits for veterans returning from World War II. It continues to do a number of things for veterans. It's done things for veterans from the Vietnam War, the first Gulf War, and then, of course, the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Another example of social policy that social workers talk about quite a bit is the Social Security Amendment of 1965, and that's simply a policy amendment that added Medicaid to the existing sort of suite of policies that fell under the umbrella of Social Security. So, like I said, these are just a couple of examples among literally hundreds of examples, and these are federal policies. These are not state policies. There are, probably hundreds more state policies that can be considered examples of social policies. Part of what we're going to do this semester, I'll say this again in a second when we conclude the lecture, but part of what we're going to do this semester is analyze a policy of your choice. And then the second thing will be to sort of educate ourselves about some of the basic policies that have shaped our modern world. And that's some of the stuff that we'll do from kind of week to week here. In general, let me just move myself down a little bit here. Social policy is created to address or solve social problems. And so social problems is sort of another, I think, important vocabulary term for the week. So social problems are things that negatively impact the quality of life for a group or groups of people. Social policies exist for two reasons, basically. So people affected by a social problem have banded together and voiced their concern to policymakers. Or a second thing has happened, and that's that someone has pointed out to sort of the national consciousness that a social problem exists. And the people who point out social problems are often policymakers themselves, researchers, donors, the media, and occasionally other groups. Every now and then you hear about the elites and the elites are this is sort of a recent term. The elites typically are policymakers, researchers, donors, and the media. This is not to say that they're elite in every respect. This is to say that they're elite in the realm of social policy making. Certainly not all policymakers or researchers or donors or even members of the media are extraordinarily wealthy. Not all of them are extraordinarily, come from extraordinary backgrounds, that kind of thing. I didn't want to get into it in this lecture, but the elites is sort of a politically charged term that people have actually created to sort of challenge this idea that only certain people can make policy. So the reason I put this term in here, I realize I'm getting off track a little bit. The reason I put this term in here is that it is something you hear thrown around in the media from time to time. I just wanted you to be aware of when people talk about the elites, in quotes, the elites. Who is it that they're referring to? So again, the elites are policymakers, researchers, donors, and the media and others, but often people who have the ability, at least in the social policy arena, to point out that a social problem exists. And so I'm building towards something else that we'll get to here in a second. But first, before we get to what it is I'm building towards, I want to talk about this idea of social problems and the social welfare system. So the social welfare system is really just a system of programs, benefits, and services that help people meet their needs. And you could think about those needs in terms of their social needs, their economic needs, their educational needs, their health needs. The social welfare system is not necessarily a bad thing. Most developed countries have a very robust social welfare system, and that's simply because this system is important to helping people meet their needs, right? So what kinds of things might include the social welfare system? And so I put that in, I guess that's the fourth bullet point down here. So just for example, schools, hospitals, churches, nonprofits, governmental agencies, programs, coalitions, clinics, all of that stuff is sort of generally fits under this idea of the umbrella of the social welfare system. This is where most of us as social workers are going to find employment, even if it's only for part of our careers. The term, just like the term elites, but the term welfare and the term social welfare is another term that's sort of been politicized in the last 30 years or so, 40 years. And it's been politicized to the point where most people think about the social welfare system as something negative, and it's not. So we use the term here really is actually something positive. It's a system that helps people meet their needs. It's a diverse system that does a lot of different things to help people meet social, economic, educational, and health needs. But this is sort of what I'm building towards. So this brings us back to this idea of needs, and I put that picture that I created back up here again. So let's think about this idea of needs. And so what I'm building towards is what kinds of questions can we ask about needs and policy's ability to make up the difference between what a person has and what society considers acceptable. So, first question: who gets to determine what society considers acceptable? Does the government? Does a church? Do a group of people? Do voters? Do people who are affected by a social problem get to determine what's considered acceptable? Whose money do we use to make up the difference? How do we assess how much a person has? Right? What if people disagree about how we come up with this accounting or this assessment of how much a person has? What if there's different methods for determining how much a person has? what if the level of what society considers acceptable changes? So what if this line goes up? What if this line goes down? Um, what if making up the difference is objectionable or offensive to certain people? So one of the things that's been in the news quite a bit lately is access to abortion, or uh, um, providing access to contraception. What if that's objectionable to people? What if that's offensive? What if that runs counter to their religion? Should they be, or their religious beliefs or cultural beliefs? Should they be expected to participate in making up that difference? Should their money go towards making up that difference? But other questions we could ask, for example, do we make up all of the difference, or only part of the difference? If we're only going to make up part of the difference, how much should be made up? What if we run out of money? What if we run out of resources? Who do we help first, right? So there, literally, a couple dozen questions that we could ask about needs and the difference and determining how much a person has. And what this gets to is that this conversation about needs and what's considered acceptable, so on and so forth, is a political process. This is politics. So a political process determines, or defines nearly every aspect of making policy, evaluating policy, determining if a policy revision is needed. All of this is influenced by politics. And so most of us think about politics as sort of Democrats and Republicans fighting against each other. I'm going to use a definition that's a little bit broader here, and that's the political process is really a struggle between two or more groups of people who have different levels of power and money, clout, so to speak, and different levels different goals and interests, and different ideas about how we achieve those goals and interests. So groups sort of participating in the political process could be politicians or other elites. Remember, elites going back to this idea of donors, media members, researchers, people who work in the social welfare system, that kind of thing. Could be people who are affected by the affected by the social problem, or even institutions, um, themselves. And actually, just to sort of say one more thing about this slide, a big part of what we're going to talk about this semester is politics, and sort of the different visions of the world that people of different political ideologies have. So one other important term, and I guess I'll put myself over here. So one other term is this idea of claims making. And so this is, I don't know, maybe the third or fourth sort of vocabulary term that we've covered here in this lecture. Claims making, sometimes written without the hyphen, but is generally a statement about what resources should be allocated to meet a recognized need. So people often make claims when to point out that that they are in need of policy to make up the difference between what it is they have and what it is they need. So, for example, a number of years ago, when the Dakota Access Pipeline was being talked about, the claim that people made was that it would disturb or cause harm to sort of land or area that had a sort of sacred or significant cultural meaning. So they were making a claim that the construction of this pipeline would be disruptive to sort of their cultural and spiritual life. And they were saying that policy was needed to protect their land, or prevent the building of this pipeline in order to protect their cultural and spiritual life. And claims making is done by all groups who are advocating for social policy. It's also done by politicians, media, sort of other members of the elite. Certainly social workers, who could arguably considered part of the elite, um, um, are also people who make claims. We often, when we're advocating for clients, what we're doing is a form of claims making. And then we also, so the last bullet point I put up here is that we also need to think about evidence that supports the veracity or the validity of a claim. And so people rely on data, personal stories, media reports, beliefs, needs assessments, lots and lots and lots of other things. Doctrine, sacred text, that kind of thing. We use all of these things to sort of uh, uh, support the veracity or the validity of a claim. So, a couple of concluding slides here. Why do we study policy? Well, um, from a practical standpoint, policy actually determines what we can and cannot do in some social work roles. Um, Policy affects our clients, and policy changes are going to affect our clients. We often assign, at least partially assign, social problems to inadequate social policy. And so when our clients are affected by social problems, part of the presence of that social problem in a person's life is due to policy. So social workers are pretty adept at recognizing sort of this multifactorial, um, uh, the multifactorial origin of problems, and part of the equation that we think about when we're thinking about why a problem exists for a particular client. Part of that equation it comes from policy. And then the last reason social workers study policy is that our goals often overlap. The social policy goals often overlap with the goals and values of our profession. So some of the goals of social policy, we talked about one already, but social justice, that's obviously a significant value of our profession. But certainly social policy also has goals like equity and self-determination that are also part of our profession. And so the argument I'm making here is that policy is one of the ways that social workers advance their vision of a better world. So we do that not only by working with people one-on-one, but we do that by advocating for different social policies as well. So where are we going this semester? We have two sort of big goals. One is to analyze policy and then advocate for policy changes. The second goal is to learn about policies that sort of form the bedrock of today's landscape of social problems. And so that'll be some of the stuff that we do week to week. This is an interesting class. We're going to talk a little bit about politics. We're going to talk about policy, obviously, quite a bit. We're going to talk about how policy works, and then analyzing it is kind of interesting as well, because it's a skill that's sort of unique to our profession. Social work sort of straddles the boundary between working with people one-on-one and sort of the macro world. And we're one of the only professions that sort of has a foot in sort of both levels of practice, the micro and the macro level of practice. And so for that reason, I always think policy is pretty interesting. At any rate, thank you for watching, and welcome to the semester.